This is the often brutal and sometimes tragic story of how massively outnumbered British, Canadian, and Indian forces transformed an American invasion of Canada into a devastating counter-offensive, bringing the war to American soil and ensuring the future of a British Canada. This will be a military and personal history. We will meet the remarkable men who made this dramatic reversal of expectations possible and follow their actions in the opening campaign in the War of 1812. Fort Dearborn, Illinois Territory, August 15th, 1812. The Americans file out of the fort, less than 100 in number, men, women, and children, as well as some Indians of the Miami tribe to escort them. Why are they abandoning the safety of the fort? None of them believe it is a good idea. They know the immense danger that awaits them in the wilderness. The Potawatomi tribe, committed enemies of the Americans, eager to avenge the defeats and loss of territory suffered in America's westward expansion, are waiting for them. From the safety of Fort Detroit, many hundreds of miles away, General Hull has ordered them to withdraw, and the commander at Fort Dearborn, Captain Nathan Heald, obeys. He met with Chief Blackbird of the Potawatomi to negotiate an agreement. The Americans will leave the Indians the stores of the fort in exchange for a safe departure. And so the little American column departs, women and children loaded into carts. The Miami Indians, led by the white Indian William Wells, cover their flanks. William Wells was taken by the Indians as a small child after his family was slain in an Indian raid. He grew up with them, learnt their language, married a woman of their people. He fought as an Indian, naked and painted, with musket and tomahawk against the Americans. Yet after a great and brutal victory over the men of his own race, he returned to white society to become an Indian agent of the United States government, a bridge between the two cultures. If anyone would have understood how foolhardy was this attempt to march to Michigan through hostile Indian country, it was him. William Wells' trained eye spied the signs of an impending ambush. He informed Captain Heald. Heald decides that a fence is the best defense. The ambush must be broken immediately, and so he leads part of the force in a charge into the Indians. A furious but futile melee ensues. This leaves the wagons vulnerable. Indians charge from all sides. The column is divided in two. The women do what they can to defend their children, slashing with swords and tools at their assailants, but the fight is hopeless. The Miami Indians, unable or unwilling to help further, withdraw as the Potawatomi commence the slaughter. Captain Heald surrenders, but not before he's badly wounded and most of his soldiers are dead. William Wells died defending the wagons. His corpse is beheaded. His heart ripped from his chest, shed out, and eaten raw by the victors. With the battle over, about half of the women and children are already dead. Some of the surviving men will be tortured to death that very night. For those who are alive, what follows is a long captivity, marched through the Indian wilderness, stragglers killed without mercy regardless of age or gender. Some will be ransomed back into white civilization. 9 of those ransomed will be ransomed by Robert Dixon, a British fur trader, enemy to the Americans, who nonetheless did what he could to alleviate the sufferings of these unfortunate people. These American frontier soldiers, settlers, their wives and children, as well as the Potawatomi, were caught up in a continental struggle between two great nations. It is the War of 1812, the final war between Britain and America, a conflict that would become steadily bloodier and embitter both sides, and in so doing determined the fate of North America up to our own times. The two countries had been at peace since the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1788 and had continued to enjoy close economic ties. However, Britain's cataclysmic confrontation with Napoleonic France had pushed Anglo-American relations to breaking point. With the repeated defeats of Britain's continental allies, British strategy evolved into ever more stringent forms of economic warfare against the French, using their navy and colonial empire to strangle the continental dominion of France. From 1807, the Americans found their trade with Europe almost entirely cut off, and were also unhappy about the way Britain searched their ships for British sailors and pressed them into Royal Navy service. After several years of steadily worsening relations, the Americans decided on war, and the means of hitting at the British was to be an invasion of Canada. A British Canada in 1812 is still being formed. It includes Lower Canada and Upper Canada, as well as New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. We will be concerned with Lower and Upper Canada, today's Quebec and Ontario. It is here that the land campaign of the war will be fought, especially in Upper Canada. These are conquered territories, acquired from the French only 60 years previously. The population of Lower Canada is very strongly French, though Montreal and Quebec City have a British component. Upper Canada is more complicated. A fifth of the population are the Loyalists, families of those who stood for Britain in the American Revolutionary War and paid for their loyalty with dispossession and exile. This group is slowly taking hold of institutional power in this province. 3/5 of the population are Americans, migrants from the United States who moved to Upper Canada after the threat of being tarred and feathered had subsided. They are mostly apolitical, having come to Canada for cheaper land and lower taxes. The remaining fifth of the population is French and Indian. Can such a population be considered reliable? Governor General of Canada, General Prevost, has worked hard to conciliate the French, but his subordinate, General Isaac Brock, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, is pessimistic. He believes 4/5 of the population of his province are basically bad, by which he meant disloyal, pro-Yankee, or at best uninterested in the political future of the province. Besides being unreliable, the population is tiny, a mere 70,000 people in Upper Canada compared to 8 million in the United States and more than 200,000 in neighboring Ohio alone. It will be Brock's mission to turn these unpromising materials into a force that can defeat the energetic and populous enemy to the south. Isaac Brock was a Guernsey man, 6 foot tall, dashing, handsome, popular with the ladies, yet a bachelor. Brock did not want to be in Canada. The real action was in Spain, the Peninsular War, fighting the French under Wellington. Yet here he was, governor of a distant, uncultured, little developed, and worst of all, peaceful colonial province. He wanted advancement and glory. He wanted war, a proper war like that in Europe. President Madison was going to give Brock the war he craved, and he was damned well going to make the best of it. But the materials, a disloyal population, and a tiny regular force of 1,600 men. In the years before the outbreak of the war, he has made what preparations he can, strengthening fortifications, strengthening the naval resources on the Great Lakes, and maintaining close contact with key Indian figures. As events would show, Brock had the energy, insight, and courage to utilize these limited resources to powerful effect and would be a key figure in saving Canada. He would lead the Loyalists, rally much of the wavering population, and win powerful allies among the Indians. The Indians play a key part in the opening campaign of the war. I'm going to call them Indians or Aboriginals in this video because that is how they were described at the time. We've already met the vengeful power of the Potawatomi. They were just one of many tribes eager for a battle with the Long Knives, as they called the Americans. Two very broad groups of Indians will be important for this story. First, there are the Indians of the American Old Northwest, the modern states of Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. They have been fighting the American encroachment on their lands for decades now, with great victories and terrible losses. Slowly, they are losing ground, but new leaders have risen amongst them. The Shawnee brothers, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. For them, war between Britain and America was an opportunity. The other group of Indians we'll be concerned with are the Six Nations people, the Iroquois, settled in the Grand River Valley of Upper Canada. In the last war, most sided with the British. Having lost to Washington, many, but by no means all, removed themselves to Canada. What followed was a complex, decades-long struggle for recognition and reward for their loyalty to Britain, primarily in the form of land rights, a struggle in which authorities in London were generally in their favour, but the Canadian colonial authorities much less keen. War for the Six Nations was not so welcome. They had relatives on both sides and feared punishment from whichever side would be victorious. On the eve of war, United States Iroquois met their Canadian brothers and implored them to stay neutral, lest the Americans punish them all. John Norton had risen to be effective leader of the Mohawk, Mohawk being one of the Six Nations. He had worked tirelessly to secure their rights to the land and believed strongly that their future lay with Britain and that American incursions must be repelled. As he himself explained, to espouse the cause of the king with alacrity was not only the most honourable cause to be pursued, but also the most agreeable, as it might afford an immediate opportunity of taking revenge upon the common enemies of all the Aboriginal race, and if the Great Spirit should favour our efforts, might preserve our country from desolation and our families from insult or distress. Isaac Brock, Tecumseh, and John Norton will be key figures in this story of how the American invasion was defeated. On June the 18th, President Madison declares war on Great Britain. Brock received the news on the 26th of June and immediately takes action. He understands that there isn't a moment to lose. He wants Mackinac Island. This island sits at a strategic location in the western Great Lakes region. He who controls Mackinac Island controls the route from Canada westwards through the lakes and into the northern reaches of the Mississippi, and with it, the lucrative fur trade. The island had been won from the French and then lost to the Americans at the conclusion of the last war. It was time to take it back. He dispatched a letter with orders to St. Joseph's Island, where Britain had a small garrison under Captain Charles Roberts. While aging and in poor health, Roberts shared Brock's vision of a rapid offensive against Mackinac. Everyone knew Mackinac was the great prize in this region. The Canadian fur traders, mostly French, and the Indians were all eager to follow Roberts in the attack, which is just as well as his regular soldiers under his command were the cast-offs, the drunks, the broken-down older soldiers of various regiments. Roberts was joined by Robert Dixon, a Scottish fur trader who had gone native, traversing the Canadian wilderness in the manner and dress of the Indians, speaking their language, and rising so high in their esteem that he was now virtually a chief in his own right. His Indians wanted to fight with the long knives. They were gnawing at the bit, ready for a slaughter. On the 8th of July, Roberts received orders from Brock. Attack Mackinac. Preparations began immediately, but then, 4 days later, he received a second order telling him to wait. Brock has been forced to hold himself back by Governor Prevost, who believed that even with the US declaration of war, that negotiations with the US can avoid fighting. 3 desperate days follow where Roberts works to keep his polyglot band of French Canadians, Indian warriors, and British adventurers together. They want to be led, but they won't hang around St. Joseph's forever. Finally, on the 12th of July, he receives a third set of orders from Brock. Beautifully ambiguous orders, essentially telling him to do whatever seems best in the circumstances. Roberts correctly understands Brock's true meaning. If you can attack, then attack. Negotiations be damned. Muskets, rifles, and tomahawks, redcoats, painted faces, and toques. The expedition rowed themselves in boats across Lake Huron to their prey. And what were the Americans of Mackinac Island doing while all of this was going on? Absolutely nothing, because amazingly, the occupants of Mackinac Island didn't even know they were at war. This is testament to how Brock had seized the initiative, to the failure of the US government to prepare immediate dispatches, and also to the actions of John Jacob Astor. Astor was an American businessman involved in the fur trade with partners in Canada, who had immediately after the declaration of war sped off to Canada in an attempt to use his personal influence for peace. In the process, spreading news of the war wherever he went, more to the benefit of the British than to the Americans. Captain Roberts had heard the news even before his orders from Brock arrived, informed by letter from a Canadian partner of John Jacob Astor. Now, it looks very much like the inhabitants of Mackinac, mostly fur traders and their families, plus some soldiers under Lieutenant Hanks, would pay the price for the oversight of Washington and the behavior of Astor. The Indians under Dixon were out for blood and eager for booty. The British force landed in the northwest of the island on the 17th of July, away from the main centre of settlement, at a site now called British Landing. They met an American fur trader, Michael Dooseman, and hailed him peacefully. The British knew Dooseman personally. The residents of both islands were known to each other. Roberts grasped an opportunity to avoid the kind of disaster that would later befall Fort Dearborn. He told the American of the mood of the Indians and implored him to assist them in quietly traversing the island to the fort. Only by a quick seizure of the island could bloodshed be avoided. The American agreed. And so, with Dooseman's help, the British crept quietly across the island, caught the small numbers of soldiers while they were sleeping, and arrested them. Mackinac was British once again, and true to their word, Captain Roberts and Robert Dixon held back the disappointed Indians who had been looking forward to a good fight. It was a remarkable, bloodless coup. The first stroke of the war was a British victory, with no casualties, and American territory was occupied. While tiny in size, the significance of the island was huge. Western fur trade was in British and Canadian hands. Britain was in control of the western Great Lakes. Just as importantly, the British had proven to the Indians that they, or at least General Brock, were serious about fighting the Americans. As news of the British action spread, Indians throughout the Northwest who had been straddling the fence now swung their weight behind the British, providing the tiny British garrison in Canada with an immediate boost in fighting manpower, which brought with it the fierce reputation of America's native warriors. The psychological effect on American leadership in the Western campaign would also be vital. As for the residents of the island, they were given a choice: swear allegiance to King George or leave. Most of them took the oath. While the matter of Mackinac was ongoing, Brock had not been inactive. The challenge facing him was multifaceted. While convinced that only an aggressive policy could save the colony, he had to contend with the superior Governor-General Prevost, who favored a defensive strategy and a home base that was politically and culturally divided. He put on a brave face before the assembled Parliament of Upper Canada in York, stacked heavily with the Loyalist minority, and praised the local response to the war. But it was nonsense. He and they both knew that much of the population didn't care one jot for the future of the British Empire. Nonetheless, a combination of Brock's personal charisma and the burgeoning vision of a loyal British Canada would combine into one purpose during the coming struggle. Canada, a certain kind of Canada, would fight for its survival. The Americans, meanwhile, had begun their offensive. In the Western campaign, aging Revolutionary War veteran General Hull crossed over to Canada on July the 12th and prepared to lay siege to Amherstburg, Canada's fortified town opposite America's Fort Detroit, ancestor of the modern city of Detroit. On arrival, Hull made a verbose proclamation addressed to the Canadians in which he promised to liberate them from British tyranny and respect their lives and property. Fatally for his cause, though, he also said he would punish with death any white Canadian in arms alongside Indian allies. Given that the British alliance with the Indian tribes was a cornerstone of Canada's defense, this essentially meant that Canadian militiamen were being told that they could expect no quarter whatsoever. John Norton was already in the area, doing his best to recruit warriors to the defense of Canada. While a European state takes upon itself the entire right to determine when its people are at war, Indian chiefs and tribal assemblies and war party leaders had to continually persuade, cajole, and bribe their men to fight. If the men did not see the war as in their interest, then they wouldn't fight, or would fight only half-heartedly. A combination of charismatic leadership and generous gift-giving was the only way to keep Indians at war long-term. This was the role assumed by the remarkable figure of John Norton. Born in Scotland to a Scottish woman and Cherokee father, he came to North America as an adult. Determination, intelligence, and hard work in the cause of Indian interests led to his adoption by the Mohawk and a position in the colonial Indian department. Having been dispatched by Brock, he was now putting all his energies into recruiting Grand River Mohawk to meet Hull's army. It was not easy. At this time, John Norton could only rally small bands to harass American foragers. After settling matters in York, Brock headed west to confront Hull. As he set out, he collected a force of Canadian militia, the young sons of loyalists, men whose ancestors had settled Jamestown or Boston or upstate New York. These men felt a commitment to the legacy of empire so recently damaged by the American Revolution and were intent on preserving the property and power of their families in this new province after being evicted from their ancestral American home. Brock would sing the praises of these men. He discovered that there were indeed Canadians who were worthy comrades in arms, worthy even to die alongside. These young Canadians demonstrated a truth of politics, that a motivated minority willing to fight for an ideal is stronger than the apolitical majority. The little band of British regulars and Canadian militia sped westwards along Lake Erie by boat. Brock won the affection of the militia with his ready familiarity and his willingness to rough it up when needed. General Hull had not acted fast to seize Amherstburg, instead wasting precious time waiting for more artillery to be brought up. It was at this time that he heard of the fall of Mackinac Island. The news shattered his confidence. He gave up on the offensive, his mind filled with visions of the Indian hordes swarming down from the north upon Michigan and Ohio. By the time Brock arrived in the west, Hull had already withdrawn back onto American soil into the seeming safety of Fort Detroit. At the same time, Hull commanded Fort Dearborn in Illinois to be abandoned, with the tragic consequences already outlined. Near Amherstburg, Brock finally met Tecumseh. Between the two of them, they were weaving a North American legend. The handsome and charismatic Shawnee warrior had engaged all his energies to unite the Northwest Indian tribes against the Americans in an alliance with Britain. In partnership with his brother, the Prophet, he was attempting to bring about a spiritual revolution among his people and forge a new sense of united nationhood. A cornerstone of this envisioned new unity was a determined animosity to the Americans. In the days before Brock's arrival, Tecumseh and his warriors had already been back and forth across the frontier, skirmishing and taking scalps and spreading fear among the Americans. On the 5th of August, a small band of warriors under Tecumseh, perhaps as few as 25, ambushed 200 American militiamen near Brownstown in Michigan Territory. The Americans lost a few dozen men as casualties, and many more scattered and deserted. 4 days later, Tecumseh, with a combined force of Indians, British infantry, and Canadian militia, ambushed a larger American force. The Americans had been dispatched south from Detroit to keep the route to Ohio open. This time, they brought regulars who were better able to withstand the ambush. Tecumseh was wounded in the leg, and British and Allied forces were beaten back with a few losses. But the Americans, despairing of continuing southwards, had returned back to Fort Detroit. Tecumseh had done an excellent job of maintaining pressure on the Americans. Now, Brock was finally here, and the next phase of the campaign could begin. The two men hit it off straight away. After meeting Brock, Tecumseh declared to his people that this was a man, while Brock in a letter described Tecumseh this way: "A more sagacious and gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. He was the admiration of everyone who conversed with him." They were bound together by a shared thirst for warfare against the Americans and an aggressive spirit that favored offense over defense. Meanwhile, General Hull in Fort Detroit was losing his grip and had lost the respect of his men. His retreat back across the river had demoralized his entire army, and his officers wrote scathing letters to their friends and family about him. To make matters worse, Brock knew all of this. A US mailboat had been captured by the British and its contents examined. Brock knew that the Americans had no faith in their leader. He knew that Hull was without confidence, that Hull feared in particular the Indians. Brock capitalized on this knowledge by dispatching a letter to Captain Roberts at Mackinac Island, in which he told Roberts he need only send 5,000 Indian warriors to join him at Amherstburg, because he already had so many with him. Now this is nonsense. There were nothing like that many warriors at Mackinac, and none of them were coming to join Brock. The letter was not meant for Captain Roberts. Rather, it was deliberately allowed to be captured by the Americans. When Hull read it, his jaw must have hit the floor. This is followed up from Brock by a note delivered to Hull informing the American general that if the fort does not surrender and a battle is fought, that the British general will not be able to guarantee that his Indian allies will respect the normal rules of war. That is, a massacre will ensue. Brock established his battery directly across the river from Fort Detroit and began his bombardment. He had no intention of a long siege. Tecumseh had informed him that yet another American detachment had headed south, and Brock wanted to take Detroit before it could return. On the night of the 15th of August, British soldiers, Canadian militia, and Indian warriors under Tecumseh and John Norton started crossing the river. Brock dressed the militia in old cast-off redcoats that his regulars no longer needed, giving the impression that his force was far more professional than it really was. In the same vein, he asked Tecumseh to take his men to the woods north of the fort, causing Hull to believe that many more Indians were present than there actually were. Fort Detroit is surrounded. Inside, Hull is breaking down. A cannonball from the British bombardment removes the legs of a fellow officer in his presence. The shock does his mental state no favors. He endlessly chews tobacco, failing to wipe away the black saliva that oozes from his mouth and ruins his clothes. He fears for his daughter and his grandchildren present in the fort with him, haunted by the vision of a tomahawk severing their scalps. Hull crumbles. He dispatches his own son, an army officer, with a white flag to parley. He asks for a 3-day truce. Brock gave him 3 hours to surrender or face an assault. The Americans capitulate. Fort Detroit is British. Michigan is occupied. 582 American regulars went into imprisonment in Quebec. 1,606 militia were paroled, meaning they could go home, but had to promise not to return to the war until an equivalent number of British prisoners were released, a method of prisoner exchange used by both sides in this war to avoid the need for large prison camps. Hull himself would be exchanged, then court-martialed by the American army and sentenced to death for his incompetent command. President Madison commuted the sentence. Once the Americans were out of the fort, a small detachment of British light infantry entered to ensure all the Americans were really out, and one Shadrach Byfield left us this story. We found 2 or 3 of the enemy remaining in the officers' apartments. They were about to destroy the colors of the 4th American Regiment, but we took the colors from them. Entering another room, I saw several men and ordered them out. Whilst walking along, I slipped and nearly fell. One of the men said, "My dear man, that is the brains of a man killed by one of your shots." Hopefully, Private Byfield was able to get the stink of human brains out of his boots. As for the colors of the 4th American Regiment, you can see them today in Cardiff Castle in Wales. By immediately seizing the initiative and through a clever series of psychological attacks upon the enemy, General Brock had won a stunning victory at almost no cost in lives to the British and acquired a vast stock of much needed stores. In the process, he has welded together a force of British regulars, loyalist militia, and Indian warriors under Tecumseh and John Norton. Tecumseh, for his part, had proven Brock and others who had worked on the Indian alliance to be absolutely right. The Indians were invaluable as light troops and a moral threat to the Americans. The American invasion in the West was halted for now, and yet this was only one of several invasion routes planned by the Americans for this year. The British have their greatest challenge still ahead of them, and General Brock is still to meet his destiny. With his great victory at Detroit secured, Brock rapidly headed back east, where the two sides eyed each other nervously from across the waters of the Niagara. He wants an immediate strike against the Americans, like that which he conducted at Detroit. Before Brock's arrival, though, Governor General Prevost had made an armistice with the overall American commander in the east, General Dearborn, hoping the two national governments would still come to an accord, and much to Brock's consternation. This gave the Americans time to build up their forces and put the British on the defensive. Despite grasping the initiative and vastly outnumbering the British, the Americans had many problems of their own to contend with. The American forces included both militia and regular US Army soldiers, each with their own officers. Officers of the two services, right up to the rank of general, argued over precedence and often refused to take orders from the other service. Militia soldiers varied in quality, and they weren't always willing to cross state lines or leave the territory of the United States. Politics further divided the Americans. General Stephen von Rensselaer, in command of the forces on the Niagara, was distrusted by his subordinates for being a Federalist, while the administration and many of their politically appointed generals were Republicans. The greatest example of discord within the American camp during this part of the campaign was that a large portion of their regular forces would not even participate because their commander, General Smith, refused to take orders from the militia general, Van Rensselaer. Americans intended to cross the river from opposite the Canadian village of Queenston. On the night of the 11th of October, nearly 2 months since the debacle at Fort Detroit, the Americans made their first attempt at a surprise crossing, only to abort the attempt after the mariner in charge of the boats went missing. At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 13th, they tried again, but not before some tactless remarks to a British emissary had given away the surprise. The greatly outnumbered British in the village under the command of Captain Dennis were able to put up a ferocious fire on the Americans as they crossed, with a cannon ideally placed on the heights to shoot at the boats. Compounding American issues, many lacked proper guidance or skills with boats and failed to cross at all. Some militia refused to get on the water. Brock, having woken to the sound of cannon fire, raced down from Fort George to lead the defense of Queenston. Along the way, he passed the York Volunteers, his favorite militia formation, and encouraged them on. They are eager to follow their hero into another victory against the invaders. He sped on, quickly reaching Queenston and riding up the heights to where his cannon is causing such havoc among the Americans. From here, he can see the full scale of the battle. He knows now this is a full-scale assault, not a diversion, and that while struggling, the Americans are slowly getting more men across the river and will soon dangerously outnumber the British in the village. He orders the light company, protecting the heights, to head down into the village and reinforce Captain Dennis. Those Americans who made it across found themselves cooped up on the banks of the river, taking heavy casualties. The commanding officer with the boats, General Van Rensselaer's younger brother Solomon, was himself wounded and taken back across to the American side. One young American officer, Captain John E. Wool, saw an opportunity to turn the tide. He knew of an old fisherman's trail that came up on the flank of the heights from where the British artillery was causing them such difficulty. With permission from his wounded commander, he took 100 men with him up the trail. He came onto Brock's flank and ordered a charge. Having sent away the light company, the British general and his artillerymen were virtually defenseless. They spike the cannon and flee down the slope. It's a heroic coup from Captain Wool. In an instant, he has transformed the battle. For the first time since they landed on Canadian soil, it now appears the Americans are going to win. Brock has been outflanked. Is he to follow his great triumph in Detroit so soon with a catastrophic defeat? He believes with all his heart that the Americans must be defeated by a strong offense and the war taken to their country. With Queenston lost, the Americans will have a bridgehead on Upper Canada, his Canada, the Canada he has been preparing to defend for years now. He makes his decision. He goes through Queenston and collects men of the 49th Regiment around him, and in the great style of the British officer through the ages, leads his men from the front in an assault on the heights to retake the gun, to expel the Americans, and to save Upper Canada. It's a steep, grassy, wet slope. The Americans fire a volley on the advancing British. The charge is broken. The men slide back down the slope, many wounded. Brock encourages the men again, implores him to follow him into the American fire a second time and defeat them with the bayonet. Again they charge, another frantic American volley. Brock falls. The hero of Detroit is dead. The soldiers carry Brock's lifeless body back down with them in retreat. Brock's aide, MacDonald, a talented young Canadian who worships his commander, is torn in his heart by the sight of his corpse. MacDonald rallies the soldiers. For a third time they will charge. MacDonald will lead them to avenge their general. Up the slope they go, American lead tearing into them. MacDonald falls, mortally wounded. Back down the grassy slope go the British. Is this it? Is this the beginning of the end of British Canada? Will the Americans win the day and commence their occupation of Canadian territory? Now led by Winfield Scott, a young man with a great history ahead of him, American soldiers are slowly expanding out from the bank, or at least some of them are. Some cling to the bank of the river in fear, praying for a boat to take them back to American soil, but enough good soldiers do their duty to expand the pocket of American occupation, and the heights and the village are in American control. For many Americans of this era, the most terrifying sound of war is not the roar of cannon and muskets, but the war whoop of the Indians. And like a nightmare, this sound now echoes across through the valley. The Mohawk are here, under John Norton. John Norton had received orders to rush from Fort George to Queenston and support Captain Dennis, while additional British regulars and militia were still being brought up. 2 miles from Queenston, he and his men heard rumours from Canadian militia that Brock was dead, as well as a false report that Queenston was already occupied by 6,000 American soldiers. The more game, the better hunting, his warriors retorted. They continued their way. Reaching Queenston, his men could see that while the earlier report was exaggerated, the American position was strong. Norton urged his warriors to glory. Comrades and brothers, be men. Remember the fame of ancient warriors whose breasts were never daunted by odds of number. You have run from your encampments to this place to meet the enemy. We have found what we came for. Let no anxieties distract your minds. There they are. It only remains to fight. Look up. It is he above who shall decide our fate. Our gallant friends, the Redcoats, will soon support us. They make a series of charges against the Americans, slowly encircling them, probing for weakness. American morale is greatly affected. Unable to see exactly what is going on, many of the Americans still on the American shore are now further convinced that they will not be getting in any boats this day. The arrival of the Mohawk is only a fraction of American problems. British and Canadian reinforcements, led by General Sheaffe, are marching from the north. Sheaffe is a much more cautious man than Brock. He sees how formidable are the heights that the Americans now possess, and declines to replicate Brock and MacDonald's glorious but fruitless charge. Instead, he takes a long route around the town, while the Mohawk and the remains of Captain Dennis's men keep the Americans in place. Coming to the plateau of the heights from the southwest, Sheaffe negates the advantage the Americans had won by seizing the high ground. After a perfectly executed maneuver, British regulars and Canadian militia fix bayonets and press on the Americans with Mohawk support. A vicious melee ensues and American casualties start to mount rapidly. Winfield Scott and his fellow officers recognize that no more support can be expected from across the river and that escape is now impossible. They are trapped and are facing slaughter. They agree amongst themselves that they must surrender to avoid the total massacre of their men. Surrender in the midst of a terrible battle is not so easy a thing. The first Americans sent to parley meet their end by the tomahawk. Scott himself assumes the dreadful duty and marches into the surrounding British with a white scarf wrapped around his sword. Thanks to the intervention of John Brant, son of the great Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, who had led his people against the Americans in the last war, Scott is safely conveyed to General Sheaffe. The American offered his surrender to another American. General Sheaffe, as it happens, was from Boston. His family were loyalists, and he had gone to military academy in England during the Revolution. Sheaffe accepted the American surrender, though it took a little more time to convince the Mohawk that the slaughter really must stop. The American army was surrendered, and 1,000 prisoners were taken. With the Americans in disarray and a third of their forces at Niagara captured or killed, now would have been an opportunity to cross over and rout them on American soil. But Sheaffe was not that kind of man. His cautious approach to battle had saved Queenston and given the British another great victory, but he blunted the achievement by agreeing to a truce with the Americans, allowing them to hold on to their positions and regroup. The Americans on the Niagara were done for this campaigning season, but they will invade again the next year. Brock certainly would have immediately counterattacked, but Major General Isaac Brock was dead. The loss of Brock stunned Canada. His funeral on the 16th of October became one of the largest public events in Upper Canada's history up to that point, with up to 5,000 people participating in the event. As his body was taken from Newark to Fort George, the British Army, Canadian militia, and Indian warriors lined the route. This was the force he had welded together to save this country. Fort George fired a 21-gun salute in his honor, and in reply, the Americans at Fort Niagara, just across the water, fired their salute for their much-respected adversary. Winfield Scott, the man who surrendered the American army at Queenston, but would go on to an incredibly important career in the US Army and earn his own place in history, later in life remembered the chivalry of the British general. He recounted a story of how a small group of Canadians had crossed the Niagara in a boat to burglarize some American homes. Brock had arrested the Canadians and sent the stolen goods back to the Americans. Brock deserves to be remembered as the savior of Upper Canada. His aggressive strategy and charismatic leadership had completely turned the tables on the Americans in the opening campaign of the war. The Indians were now allies, and the white residents, whether loyalist or not, now had much greater confidence in the British capacity to keep the province. Given the important part played by the Indians and the need to keep as much of the population from supporting the Americans as possible, this achievement was vital. As should be clear from this narrative, the role of the Indians was incredibly significant. They provided key manpower and instilled terror in the Americans, helping to nullify America's numerical advantage. Brock is central to the equation because his actions kept the Indians on the British side. Of course, the war was not yet over. Tecumseh and John Norton have many battles ahead of them, as do Winfield Scott and the Americans. The Americans performed terribly on land in 1812, but they are going to do better as the war proceeds. Old veterans of the Revolutionary War, like General Hull, will be replaced with younger, more talented commanders. They will professionalize their forces, and they will invade again. They will, ultimately, defeat Tecumseh and break up his Indian Confederacy, his dream of an independent and strong Indian realm crushed. But in regards to Canada, this success against the Northwest Indians does them little good. The Americans had their best chance to take Canada in the campaign of 1812, when the population was divided and the manpower and resources at a minimum. Just as the Americans are going to improve, so the British will be bringing ever larger numbers of troops across the Atlantic as the war in Europe against Napoleon wraps up. While the next 2 years of war will have ups and downs for both sides, the moment when an American conquest of Canada looked most feasible has now already passed.